The bullet grazed his shoulder, a hot streak of pain that barely registered over the deafening roar of war. James Callahan, crouched in the Iraqi desert, clutched his rifle, his heart pounding not just from the enemy fire, but from the secret he'd buried deeper than any foxhole. He was a soldier, a father, a man who loved another man, and no one could ever know. 20 years later, James stood in his Wyoming kitchen, the scent of coffee mingling with the crisp autumn air drifting through the open window. His hands, still callous from years of gripping weapons, now trembled as he poured a second cup. The war was long over, but the battle inside him raged on. He glanced at the photo on the fridge. His son, Ethan, grinning at his high school graduation, oblivious to the truth his father had hidden for decades. "Dad, we need to talk." Ethan's voice broke through, urgent and unsteady. He stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame, his blue eyes, James's eyes, searching for something. James's stomach twisted. He'd faced insurgents, IEDs, and the chaos of combat, but nothing terrified him more than the possibility of this moment. "Sit down, son," James said, his voice steady despite the storm inside. Ethan hesitated, then slid into a chair, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. The kitchen clock ticked loudly, each second a hammer against James's resolve. He'd spent his life building walls. Around his heart, his truth, his love. Now he felt them cracking. "I'm gay, Dad," Ethan said, the words tumbling out like a confession long held back. "I've known for years, but I didn't know how to tell you. I was scared you'd hate me." James froze. The air seemed to vanish from the room. He saw himself at 20, sneaking glances at Michael, his bunkmate in basic training, their hands brushing during late-night talks, the ache of wanting what he could never have. He'd buried that love under duty, under marriage, under fatherhood. He'd fought for his country's freedom while chaining his own. "Ethan," James started, his voice rough, "I could never hate you." He wanted to say more, to spill the truth he'd locked away, but fear clamped his throat shut. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand hovering before resting on Ethan's. "You're my son. That's all that matters." Ethan's eyes welled up, relief flooding his face. I thought you'd be like Grandpa. You know how he was. All that talk about real men and fixing people like me." James winced. His father's voice still echoed in his head, a ghost from childhood spent learning to hide. "Your grandfather was wrong," he said firmly. "You don't need fixing. You're perfect as you are." The words felt like a betrayal of his own silence. James had lived by his father's rules, married Ellen to prove he was normal, raised Ethan in a house built on half-truths. Ellen had known, in her quiet way, about James's heart. She'd loved him anyway, until cancer took her 5 years ago. Now, with Ethan's truth laid bare, James felt the weight of his own cowardice. That night, James couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, the Wyoming stars sprawling above, and thought of Michael. They'd parted ways after the war, Michael moving to San Francisco, James retreating to this small town. He'd heard Michael was happy now, married to a man, living openly. James envied him, not just his freedom, but his courage. The next morning, Ethan brought a friend to breakfast. "Dad, this is Lucas," he said, his voice shy but proud. Lucas was tall, with sandy hair and a warm smile, his hand lingering on Ethan's arm. James shook Lucas's hand, his grip firm but his heart racing. He saw himself in Ethan's hesitant joy, in the way Lucas's presence lit up the room. It was like watching his own past, rewritten with hope. Over coffee, Lucas talked about his work as a teacher, his passion for history, his love for Ethan. James listened, nodding, but his mind drifted to the letters he'd never sent to Michael, the life he'd never lived. When Lucas mentioned a local pride event, James's chest tightened. "You go to that?" he asked, his tone casual, but his pulse anything but. "Yeah," Ethan said, glancing at Lucas. "It's next weekend. You could come, Dad, if you want." James forced a smile, his mind screaming. Maybe, he said, the word heavy with possibility. He imagined walking into that crowd, the stares, the whispers. He'd faced death in combat, but this felt like a different kind of battlefield, one where the enemy was his own fear. As the week passed, James wrestled with Ethan's invitation. He mowed the lawn, fixed the truck, did anything to avoid thinking about it. But every night, he saw Ethan's face, the hope in his eyes, and felt the pull of something stronger than fear: love. He wanted to be the father Ethan deserved, not the man who'd hidden his whole life. On Saturday, James stood in front of his mirror, his old dog tags dangling against his chest. He was 58, too old to keep running from himself. He thought of Ethan, of Lucas, of the pride flag he'd seen waving in town. He thought of Michael, living his truth while James had buried his own. The reflection staring back wasn't just a soldier or a father. It was a man who'd loved in silence for too long. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, his heart pounding like it had in the desert all those years ago. This time, he wasn't fighting for his country. He was fighting for himself. The Pride event was a riot of color, a small-town affair that had taken over Main Street with rainbow flags and laughter. James parked his truck a block away, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if it could anchor him. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the crowd or the possibility of seeing himself in it. He stepped out, his boots heavy on the pavement. The air buzzed with music and voices, a stark contrast to the quiet of his ranch. Families, couples, and groups of friends mingled under banners proclaiming love and acceptance. James scanned the crowd for Ethan, his heart a mix of pride and panic. He hadn't told his son he was coming. He wasn't sure he'd stay. "Dad!" Ethan's voice cut through the noise. He stood a few feet away, Lucas at his side, both holding cups of lemonade. Ethan's face lit up, disbelief giving way to a grin. "You're here." James nodded, his throat tight. "Thought I'd check it out," he said, his voice gruff. Lucas smiled, offering a cup. "Glad you came, Mr. Callahan. It means a lot to Ethan." They walked together, Ethan pointing out booths selling rainbow pins and local artist work. James felt eyes on him, not hostile but curious. He was a known figure in town, the retired veteran who kept to himself. Now, he was here, walking beside his son and his son's boyfriend, under a sky painted with colors he'd never dared wear. At a booth selling books, James paused. A memoir caught his eye, Love in the Trenches, about a gay soldier's life after Vietnam. His fingers brushed the cover, memories of Michael flooding back. Ethan noticed his brow furrowing. "You okay, Dad?" "Yeah," James lied, forcing a smile. "Just remembering." He bought the book, tucking it under his arm like a secret. As they moved through the crowd, Ethan and Lucas held hands, their ease a quiet rebuke to James's decades of restraint. He envied their freedom, their youth, their courage to love openly in a world that hadn't always been kind. The event culminated in a speech by a local activist, a woman with a voice that carried both fire and hope. She spoke of love as a right, not a privilege, and of the battles still being fought. James listened, his chest tight. He'd fought for freedom overseas, but here, in his own country, he'd let fear win. The activist's words hit like shrapnel. Hiding who you are isn't living. It's surviving. That night, back home, James sat with the memoir, its pages heavy with someone else's truth. He read about stolen moments in barracks, about letters burned to keep secrets safe, about a life reclaimed after years of silence. Each word felt like a mirror, reflecting his own buried love. He thought of Michael, of the nights they'd talked under the stars, their voices low to avoid detection. He'd loved Michael with a fierceness that scared him, a love he'd locked away when he returned to civilian life. The next day, James drove to the lake, the memoir still in his truck. He sat on the dock, the water lapping softly, and pulled out his phone. Michael's number was still in his contacts, a relic from a life he'd tried to forget. His thumb hovered over the call button. What would he say? That he'd been a coward? That he'd never stopped loving him? Before he could decide, Ethan called. "Dad, you were great yesterday." I didn't expect you to show up. His voice was warm, but there was a question in it. You seemed different, like something was on your mind. James swallowed hard. Just thinking about the past, he said. About choices I made. Ethan was quiet for a moment. You could talk to me, whatever it is. I know, son, James said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm trying. After the call, James stared at the lake, the memoir open in his lap. He'd spent his life fighting battles for others, his country, his family, his reputation. But the hardest battle was the one he'd avoided, the fight to be himself. Ethan's courage had cracked open a door James had kept locked, and now he had to decide whether to step through. He dialed Michael's number, his heart racing as it rang. When a familiar voice answered, James's breath caught. Michael? It's James. I need to see you. San Francisco was a world away from Wyoming, its streets alive with color and chaos. James stepped off the plane, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, feeling like a soldier landing in foreign territory. Michael had agreed to meet him, his voice warm but cautious over the phone. It's been a long time, James, he'd said, but I'm glad you called. They met at a cafe overlooking the bay, the Golden Gate Bridge, a hazy silhouette in the distance. Michael looked different, grayer, softer around the edges, but his eyes still held the same spark James remembered. They sat, coffee steaming between them, the weight of 20 years hanging in the silence. You look good, Michael said, breaking the ice. Wyoming's been kind to you. James chuckled, rubbing his neck. It's been quiet. Too quiet, maybe. He hesitated, then added, I heard you got married. Congratulations. Michael smiled, his ring glinting in the light. Thanks. Tom's a good man. We've been together 10 years. He paused, studying James. What about you? Still keeping the world at arm's length. The question stung, but James didn't flinch. I'm trying not to, he said. My son, he came out to me. You got a boyfriend, Lucas. They're happy. It's made me think. Michael's eyes softened. That's big, James. I'm proud of you for being there for him. James looked down, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. I haven't told him everything. About me. About us. The word felt like a grenade, dangerous and heavy. I loved you, Michael. I never stopped, but I was too scared to live it. Michael's breath caught, his expression unreadable. You don't owe me an explanation, he said quietly. We were kids in a war. We did what we had to do to survive. But I didn't survive, James said, his voice breaking. I buried it. I married Ellen, raised Ethan, played the part. And now Ethan's out there, living his truth, and I'm still hiding. Michael reached across the table, his hand resting lightly on James's. You're here now. That's a start. They talked for hours, the past unraveling like a spool of thread. James learned about Michael's life, his activism, his marriage, his fight for acceptance. Michael listened as James spoke of Ellen's death, Ethan's courage, the pride event that had shaken him awake. When they parted, Michael hugged him, a brief but fierce embrace that felt like coming home. Back in Wyoming, James felt lighter, but the weight of his secret remained. He invited Ethan and Lucas over for dinner, determined to take the next step. As they ate, James watched them, their laughter filling the house with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. After dessert, he cleared his throat. Ethan, Lucas, he began, his voice steady but his hands shaking under the table. There's something I need to tell you, something I've never told anyone. Ethan's eyes widened, and Lucas leaned forward, attentive. James took a deep breath, the words he'd rehearsed 1,000 times finally breaking free. I'm gay. I've known since I was younger than you, Ethan. I loved a man during the war, and I let him go because I was afraid. I don't want to be afraid anymore. The silence was deafening. Then Ethan stood, crossed the room, and pulled James into a hug. Dad, he whispered, I'm so proud of you. Lucas joined them, his hand on James's shoulder. You're not alone anymore, Mr. Callahan. That night, James cried for the first time in years, tears of relief and regret. He'd spent decades fighting for others' freedom while denying his own. Now, with Ethan's arms around him, he felt the first stirrings of liberation. The news spread slowly through town, as secrets do in small places. James had told Ethan and Lucas, but he hadn't expected the ripple effect. A neighbor asked about the pride flag Ethan had hung on the porch. A coworker at the hardware store where James worked part-time gave him a knowing nod. He felt exposed, but also strangely free. Ethan pushed him to join a local LGBTQ support group, a small gathering in the community center. James resisted at first, the idea of sharing his story with strangers unthinkable. But Ethan's persistence wore him down. "You don't have to talk, Dad. Just listen." The group was a mix of ages and stories. Teenagers, parents, a retired teacher who'd come out at 70. James sat in the back, his arms crossed, listening as a young woman spoke about her girlfriend, her voice trembling with pride. An older man shared his regret at waiting so long to live openly. Each story chipped away at James's armor, reminding him he wasn't alone. After the meeting, a man named Paul approached him. He was in his 60s, with kind eyes and a quiet strength. "You're new," Paul said, offering a handshake. "Veteran, right? I can tell by the way you carry yourself." James nodded, surprised. "Yeah, Army. You?" "Navy," Paul said, smiling. "Served in the 80s. Hit who I was the whole time. Sound familiar?" They talked over coffee, Paul's easy manner putting James at ease. He spoke of his partner, David, who'd passed away 2 years ago. "We had 20 years together," Paul said. "Not enough, but more than I ever thought I'd get." James found himself returning to the group, drawn by Paul's stories and the sense of community. He started sharing, first in halting sentences, then in longer bursts. He spoke of Michael, of the war, of Ethan's courage. Each word felt like a step toward freedom. One evening, Paul invited James to dinner at his house, a cozy place filled with photos of him and David. Over steak and wine, they talked about life after the closet. "It's not too late, Paul said. "To live, to love." James looked at him, the words stirring something he'd thought long dead. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. "I've spent so long hiding." Paul reached for his hand, his touch warm and steady. "You don't have to rush, but you deserve to be happy, James." Weeks turned into months, and James found himself spending more time with Paul. They hiked together, shared beers on James's porch, laughed over old war stories. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something close, something that made James's heart beat faster. Ethan noticed the change. "You're smiling more, Dad," he said one day, helping James fix a fence. "Is it that guy from the group?" "Paul." James blushed, caught off guard. "He's a friend," he said, but the warmth in his voice betrayed him. Ethan grinned. "You deserve this, Dad. You deserve to be happy." As winter settled over Wyoming, James felt a shift. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, tentatively but living. Paul's presence was a quiet anchor, a reminder that it was never too late to start over. Spring brought new life to Wyoming, the fields blooming with wildflowers, the air soft with possibility. James stood on the dock by the lake, Paul at his side, their hands brushing as they watched the sunset. Ethan and Lucas were there too, their laughter carrying across the water as they tossed a frisbee. It was a moment of peace, a snapshot of a life James had never dared dream of. He'd been seeing Paul for months now, their friendship blossoming into something deeper. It wasn't the fiery passion of his youth with Michael, but a quieter, steadier love, built on shared stories and mutual healing. Paul had his scars, just as James did, and together they were learning to carry them. Ethan's coming out had been the spark, but it was James's choice to step into the light that had changed everything. He'd faced his fear, not just for himself, but for his son, who deserved a father who lived authentically. The town had surprised him. Some whispered, some judged, but most simply accepted. The hardware store manager had even hung a small rainbow sticker in the window, a quiet nod to James and Ethan. One evening, James took Paul to the lake, the memoir from the Pride event tucked under his arm. He'd finished it months ago, but it felt right to bring it here, to the place where he'd first dared to call Michael. They sat on the dock, the water reflecting the stars, and James opened the book to a dog-eared page. "Read this," he said, passing it to Paul. It was a passage about forgiveness, not just of others, but of oneself. "I've been hard on myself for a long time," James admitted. "For the years I lost, the chances I didn't take. But I'm done with that." Paul's eyes shone with understanding. "You're here now," he said, echoing Michael's word from months ago. "That's what matters." James took Paul's hand, his grip firm and unafraid. "I want to live, Paul. With you if you'll have me." Paul's smile was answer enough. They kissed, soft and tentative, the lake a silent witness to a love James had finally claimed. The next day, James invited Ethan and Lucas to the ranch. He wanted to share his happiness, to show his son the man he'd become. As they sat around the kitchen table, James felt a surge of gratitude. Ethan had given him the courage to face himself, and Paul had shown him it was never too late to love. "Dad," Ethan said, raising a glass, "to living your truth." James raised his own, his eyes meeting Paul's. "To freedom," he said, the word carrying the weight of a lifetime. As the sun set over the Wyoming hills, James felt the last of his walls crumble. He'd fought for his country, for his son, for himself. And in the end, he'd won the only battle that mattered, the one for his own heart.